right in the container. Hello, you wonderful people. How the heck are you today? Coming off the heels of my recent Pikmin video, today I'd like to talk about another series that I talk about a lot, yet I don't really make a lot of dedicated videos on. I'm of course referring to sweet, beautiful Metroid. Obviously, it's not like there have been a whole lot of new Metroid games coming out recently, and my own videos on the topic have been a little hit or miss. My Metroid Prime 4 stuff has done pretty well, but then some of my Samus Return stuff didn't do that well at all comparatively. Metroid content on my channel is still fairly untested territory. So what do you say we do some more testing? Even though this is another video about Metroid Prime 4, so it's not really a fair test. If I wanted a real test, I would make one of the several videos I have planned about the series, but have been putting off because I don't know how viable they are, including an in-depth proposal on how Nintendo could revitalize and relaunch the series. But today, a wishlist video will have to do. At the time of this recording, Metroid Prime 4 is still a long ways off. A long ways off. But that won't stop me from talking about it. The original trilogy set the bar incredibly high, and the first game in particular is one of my very favorite games in the whole wide world. So naturally, I'm going to go into Metroid Prime 4 with some pretty high hopes. I mean, 15 years is a very long time to wait for a new game in a series, so I don't want 4 to be any old Metroid Prime game. I want it to be big. I want it to modernize Metroid Prime and deliver it to a whole new generation of gamers, and most importantly, I want it to cater exactly to my specific list of desires. I think that's reasonable, don't you? Well, enough yakking and on to the yakking! These, my friends, are my hopes for Metroid Prime 4. Isn't this the coolest? A fan gave me this at PAX. Look what he made it do. Ooh. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the game's narrative. The first Metroid Prime had a huge focus on isolation and delivered its narrative very passively. Samus was very much alone on Talon 4, and the events that led up to her arrival were told mainly through log entries. The second game was largely the same, though it introduced a speaking character and a number of actual alive people who were depending on Samus to save them, thus leaning a little more toward a traditional narrative. Then the third game went all out with its story, several speaking characters, and an ongoing plot that spanned a number of different planets. I can absolutely appreciate Prime 3's heavier emphasis on story for two reasons. One, I just love stories, and I feel like more Nintendo games should have them. Two, being the third game in the trilogy, it made sense to open things up and try a new approach. We'd already had two very similar games, so why not finish the story arc off with something bigger? However, I feel that the storytelling in the first game had an unmatched elegance to it. Passive storytelling and heavy emphasis on isolation and atmosphere just fits Metroid so well. So I would like it if Prime 4 goes back to the Prime series roots, as it were, and gives us one planet, few to no other characters, and tons of log entries. If this turns into another trilogy, then I will absolutely be happy with it following the same sort of path, with each entry opening up the story more and more. But because it's been so long since the last trilogy, I feel like this is something of a new starting point. Not a reboot, but a chance to start fresh and boil the series down to what it does best. This is a new adventure for Samus, and it needs to feel that way. Which leads me to my next wish. I want Prime 4 to strike a good balance between being faithful to the story thus far and still offering something totally new. The original trilogy was all about Phazon, pure and simple. Phazon is a weird radioactive substance with incredible mutagenic and corruptive properties, and it was at the heart of the entire ongoing plot. I want the new game to follow these events and even reference them a fair amount when they're relevant, but I also want it to forge a new path. I want it to move in a brand new direction and sow the seeds for that new trilogy I so crave. Prime 1 was terrific because it began a trilogy without it even being obvious. It could have been a standalone game, but then through the next two games, we were shown how it all fit into a greater story, and I thought that was really cool. I'd like to see that same thing happen here. A nice little story that feels like it could work on its own, but that eventually gets expanded and continued by future games. Now, we do run into something of a potential issue here. The Metroid Prime trilogy takes place very early in the Metroid timeline, right after the first game. This limits Prime 4's potential to advance the Metroid universe. Everything that happens has to fit within that timeline. And sure, you could just consider these side stories that don't affect later games, But I feel like there's a limit to how much you can do with Samus in this kind of scenario. From Metroid 2 and onward, we know who Samus is and what's been going on in the galaxy, and if you start building this giant series of side stories that take place super early on, it starts to get weird that none of it is referenced later on. At one point, series co-creator Yoshio Sakamoto said some stuff that made everyone think that maybe the Prime games were a part of their own separate canon, though by now it seems that that just isn't true. However, I will say, even though this is kind of its own huge discussion for another day, while I was once disturbed by the idea that the Prime games weren't canon, I'm more comfortable than ever with the idea of them being their own thing. Like, I keep thinking about this whole story limitation thing, and I look at how Nintendo obviously just doesn't care to continue the story of the main series. Metroid Fusion, aka Metroid 4, was nearly 20 years ago, and I wonder if Metroid would just be better off if Prime could do whatever it wanted without worrying about the greater timeline. I don't know, like I said, that's kind of something to talk about later. Technically, if the word Prime comes to simply mean a Metroid but in first person, they could place a Prime game after the events of any Metroid game. Maybe Prime 4 will take place after Fusion. Because of the ends of both Prime 3 and Federation Force, that's doubtful, but hey, who knows? Okay, that was a bit of a long aside, but the point is that however they do it, even if it means somewhat disappointingly trying to not step on the toes of any of the other games, I want Prime 4 to start some big new story. I feel that Phazon did everything for the Metroid universe that it could do, so I don't think it should be the primary focus anymore. Give us a brand new threat. The title Metroid Prime actually refers to the main antagonist of the original trilogy, so one could argue that they've either got to ditch the name or stick with stories about Phazon forever, but I just wouldn't agree with that. Prime's just kind of a cool word. They can use it however they want, even if the actual entity, quote-unquote Metroid Prime, is out of the picture. I mean, Metroid Prime Hunters was its own separate story, so there you go. Now here's a pretty major wish. Similarly to how Metroid Prime 3 changed how story and characters were handled, it also featured much more linear design. Unfortunately, this change was not as easy to appreciate. It had all these long, thin corridors, which were a huge pain to navigate. Prime 1 and 2, on the other hand, were naturally more open. They had you dipping back and forth between worlds and doing a pretty hefty amount of backtracking. I'll admit the non-linearity of these games is hugely debatable. When does backtracking create a feeling of non-linearity, and when does it simply act as needless padding? Do Prime 1 and 2 simply give the illusion that they're more open, when in reality you're still going to hit every single major upgrade in the same order? I don't know for sure, and it's another big discussion for another day. But I do know that whatever the case, whether it's legitimate or only a convincing illusion, I want Prime 4 to be an open experience. Very little thrills me as much as exploration in a game, and feeling like I'm forging my own path through a massive world. Super Metroid in particular always gives me that thrill, along with the intense satisfaction of opening up new areas using new power-ups. As with the storytelling, I want Prime 4 to return to its less linear roots, or better yet, offer the least linear Prime game yet. It would also be great if more of the game's gating could be done using actual abilities. I love the Prime games to death, but being able to open a certain color door simply because I got the corresponding weapon was never nearly as interesting as reaching new ledges because I got the space jump, or breaking certain barriers because I got the power bombs. I want power-ups to feel like something. I want there to be a real reason why they let me access new areas. And another thing, along with being at least relatively non-linear, it sure would be nice if the game offered more fast travel options. Backtracking in the original trilogy could be something of a chore, leading to a whole huge ton of wasted time if you frequently got lost or failed to find what you were looking for. Samus Returns, on the other hand, added in a bunch of elevators and transporter points, so that wherever you were, you could get where you wanted with relative speed. Yet another huge discussion is, how many fast travel points is too many? When does convenience hinder exploration and the satisfaction of traversal? Where is the line between explorative backtracking and busy work? And yet again, I do not have all the answers. Not really sure why we keep skirting the edges of these massive subjects. I guess Metroid just opens up a lot of really good game design discussions. But whatever the case, whatever the perfect number of fast travel points may be, all I'm asking for is a little more than we've had in the past. Take the first 3 Prime games and, add at least a good chunk more than that. That's my perfect number. A good chunk more than in the first 3 games. There you go. And speaking of nuanced discussions regarding game design, you know what else I really want to experience in Metroid Prime 4? Real pretty graphics. The first 3 games were on the absolute cutting edge of console graphics at the time. The Xbox was significantly more powerful than the GameCube, and just about everything looked better on Xbox, and yet Prime 1, in my opinion, smoked all of the competition. It was the best looking game of that generation. Many games do not age incredibly well, and yet I am still blown away by how amazing those games look. They're so slick, the art style is so good, the lighting is simply incredible. I don't know what sort of voodoo magic those folks at Retro Studios tapped into. The Wii was only a sliver more powerful than the GameCube, and yet they were able to take even that one little sliver and make Prime 3 look that much better, with amazing lighting and reflections and bloom effects that brought the game up to a whole new level of polish. And I want to see that same level of artistic talent and development skill and technical optimization in Prime 4. Games like Luigi's Mansion 3 show us what the Switch is capable of in the right hands. And if Retro was able to make a GameCube game that still looks incredible 2 decades later, can you imagine what they might be able to do with Prime 4? Graphics aren't everything, Nintendo doesn't focus on raw graphics, blah blah blah. I don't care. I want Metroid Prime 4 to be the single best looking Nintendo game ever, hands down. I want an unbelievably slick sci-fi world that does exactly what the Wii did in those rare cases where the developers really took advantage of the hardware and made you swear you were looking at a game on a much more powerful system. Because you know what? Sometimes it's just nice to look at some pretty graphics. They're not required, but I sure do like them from time to time. And hey, if they want to prove that Metroid has what it takes to be a big, exciting AAA series, then this ain't a bad idea at all. This wish is also a pretty major one, because it could potentially make or break the game for a lot of people. The controls need to work. They need to be intuitive. They can't require any weird gimmicks, and all motion controls need to be optional. Prime on the GameCube used one stick moving and aiming, and while it did work, it's a very archaic and unnecessary control scheme now. Prime 3 and Prime Trilogy used IR aiming, and this did allow for a pretty good level of accuracy. But that wouldn't work on the Switch if you wanted to play in handheld mode, and even docked would be a lot trickier without an IR sensor to keep everything properly calibrated at all times. If you ask me, Prime 4 needs to give us straight-up 2-stick controls, just like every other shooter released on the market in the last 3 generations. I would love optional gyro aiming as well, just to help fine-tune shots. Now, the original control limitations were what led to the series' lock-on system, which in turn opened up its own unique gameplay opportunities. If you offer traditional controls, will that interfere with the lock-on system, or even make it completely unnecessary? Yet another bigger discussion, but I think the answer is no. I think you can have the comfort of aiming with the right stick while still finding reasons to lock onto enemies. In fact, they could even use a pseudo Prime 3 style. That game allowed the player to lock on, but then still use the IR to aim freely within a circle. What if you can aim wherever you want, and when you lock onto an enemy, you still have to do some of that manual aiming, only with the right stick instead? It would take some tweaking, but I'm sure Retro can pull such a thing off and make it feel really good, and that's my wish for the controls. They gotta live up to the FPS standards set by the rest of the industry, or they'll end up alienating too many new players. But they should also stay true enough to the original Prime games so that core gameplay DNA remains intact. Here's something of a minor wish. As you probably know, I'm not a big multiplayer guy, but I think it would be cool if Metroid Prime 4 had a decent multiplayer element. I know it was a little thrown together as a slightly lame attempt to compete with Halo, but I actually thought the multiplayer mode in Prime 2 was pretty fun. Then of course, the rarely discussed Prime Hunters was basically a multiplayer Metroid, but with the story part tacked on, and it offered a bunch of different characters and a fair amount of depth. People like their multiplayer, so I think it would be worth exploring in Prime 4. I mean, if you've laid the groundwork for a shooter and built a massive world around it, I can't imagine it would take that much more effort to build up some arenas and power-ups and whatnot. Not the easiest thing in the world, but certainly doable. And even if it didn't turn Metroid Prime into the next Splatoon, it could attract a decent audience if done right. Furthermore, Federation Force showed us what cooperative Metroid Prime looks like, and if they do a PvP mode in Prime 4, I'd love to get a co-op mode as well. I mean, Splatoon has Salmon Run, Luigi's Mansion has Scare Scraper, so I could easily see Metroid Prime getting some similar mode where you work with other players to kill stuff, or collect stuff, or escort stuff, or any number of stuffs. Oh, what if you work through little mini campaigns that have a lot of the same power-ups as the single player, so everyone has to figure out who gets what and work together to progress? Dude, that would be fun. There's a lot of potential there, and if a co-op mode like this uses isolated sections of the main game's map, a la RE Revelations raid mode, it will be that much simpler to develop. Oh man, my imagination's running wild with this now. This is no longer a minor wish. I want this. My final wish is more of what I talked about at the beginning of the video. Nintendo giving this series another chance after so many years of struggles is a really, really huge deal. If Metroid Prime is going to keep being a thing, maybe even if Metroid itself is going to keep being a thing, then this game needs to do well. It needs to. But Metroid doesn't have the benefit of millions and millions of fans who will buy it no matter what. This game needs to prove itself in order to reach as many new people as possible. One final time, I will say that the reasons for Metroid's past struggles and what the series should do to build a new audience is much too big to get into right now, but at the very least, I will say this. It's going to take a lot of work. Nintendo's track record has been a little weird in recent years. Forgive me if I run the risk of starting an argument here, but personally, I feel like most first-party games on the Switch fall into two categories. The games that took a ton of effort and really pushed their respective series forward, and the ones that are just kind of happy being whatever. Same old, same old. And of course, predating the Switch, Nintendo's put out some games that a ton of work went into, but they focused on gameplay elements or concepts that just didn't mesh with audiences. Metroid Prime 4 cannot fall into either of those latter camps. Retro can't put out a half-hearted, low-budget effort. They can't compromise the draw of the series by drastically altering the core formula for no apparent reason. They can't alienate the series fans by contradicting everything we know and love about Samus. If the only way for Metroid Prime to stick around is for Prime 4 to sell well, then the only way for Prime 4 to sell well is to appeal to every single fan of the originals and new people alike. It can't fall into the same trap as basically every Metroid before it. Oh, this game would have been successful, but no, you only get one shot. Do not miss your chance to Metroid roll. Chance to roll. That doesn't really rhyme. Got it. You only got one shot. Do not miss your chance, Retro. This opportunity comes once in 15 years. Got it. Oh, wait. I've actually got one more wish, though. It's not technically something I want Prime 4 to do. If the game is to succeed, there's something else that needs to happen, and it's give us Metroid Prime Trilogy on Switch already. Stop not doing it and do it instead, please. Put it on this guy Switch here's man's right here, please. Thank you, please. Well, that's it for my wishes for Metroid Prime 4. Is it perhaps a little premature to talk about what I want from the game when it could still be 3 or 4 years away? Yeah? Yeah, probably. But we do what we can to make the time go by a little faster. A teeny, tiny bit faster. Anyway, share your hopes for Metroid Prime 4 in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and you have a wonderful day. I should name him Marty.